The storm was never an accident. Madison understood that before the helicopter blades slowed, before the shoreline sharpened into view, before the island revealed its careful geometry beneath the clouds. The realization came in the first violent drop of turbulence, when the pilot swore under his breath and Caleb did not react at all. He did not brace. He did not ask questions. He did not look out the window. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and tightened his grip on the slim black folder resting against his leg, as if this exact moment had already been rehearsed. That was the first 30 seconds, and they were enough. From the air, the island looked too composed to be real. The sand curved in a precise crescent, palms stood evenly spaced, their crowns trimmed just enough to survive wind without resistance. No wild overgrowth, no erosion scars, no signs of neglect. It did not look discovered, it looked selected, purchased, corrected. Madison felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude or air conditioning. This was not a place meant to be visited. It was a place meant to be used. She turned her head slightly, studying her husband's profile. Caleb Pierce, celebrated investor, generous donor, man whose name appeared on hospital wings and scholarship funds. The man who had built an empire on calm decisions and impeccable timing. His face showed mild interest, nothing more. No tension, no surprise. As the pilot announced a sudden change in weather patterns and the approach of an unexpected tropical system, Caleb nodded once, slow and measured, as if confirming a detail rather than receiving new information. Madison's stomach tightened. She had learned to recognize that nod. It meant anticipation, not reaction. Formally, this trip was meant to save their marriage. Months of polite distance, postponed conversations, shared silence stretched thin between penthouse walls and charity dinners. The island was supposed to be neutral ground. A pause, a place without distractions. Unspoken therapy wrapped in luxury. That was the version she had agreed to. Informally, she knew there was another reason. The island was part of a development deal, a future elite resort sold to environmental boards and investors as sustainable perfection. Caleb had insisted on seeing it one last time before final signatures. What Madison did not realize, until the helicopter began its descent, was that the deal had already been closed. The pilot's voice grew tighter as the wind picked up. He mentioned staff evacuation, how the weather system had accelerated overnight, how most non-essential personnel had been pulled earlier that morning as a precaution. Earlier than forecast, earlier than public advisories. Madison watched the water below, darkening fast, waves breaking harder than they should have for a storm that was supposedly just arriving. She looked back at Caleb. He smiled at her then, soft and reassuring, placing his hand briefly over hers. The gesture was perfect. Too perfect. Calibrated. The kind of touch meant to soothe without inviting questions. She let it happen because questioning it would mean acknowledging the unease growing in her chest, and she was not ready to name it yet. They landed on an empty dock. No welcoming staff, no resort manager, no assistants with tablets or umbrellas, just one caretaker standing at the edge of the pier, older, lean, eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on them. He did not introduce himself. He handed Caleb a key card, then a second set of keys, metal and heavy, obsolete in a world of digital locks. Redundancy disguised as caution. The caretaker's boat engine started almost immediately after, cutting through the water with urgency that felt inappropriate for a routine handoff. Within minutes, the boat was gone. The mainland disappeared into rain. Madison stood barefoot on the dock, listening to the wind rise, realizing with a slow, cold clarity that the evacuation had not been rushed. It had been scheduled. The main house waded uphill, glass and concrete embedded into the rock as if it had grown there. It was beautiful in the way architectural renderings are beautiful. Clean lines, no warmth. Inside, everything worked. Power, water, climate control. The air was cool and dry despite the humidity outside. The house had been running long before they arrived, systems tested and maintained, as though it had been expecting occupants. The kitchen was stocked with fresh food, vacuum-sealed and labeled with dates too recent to be coincidence. Bottled water lined the shelves in exact quantities. Emergency lighting indicators glowed faintly along the floor. A generator cycled briefly outside, loud enough to be noticed, then settled into silence. Proof of readiness. Madison moved through the house slowly, fingers grazing surfaces, counting exits without meaning to. She noticed cameras before Caleb mentioned security. Small, recessed, carefully placed. Coverage without intrusion. Observation without intimacy. The absence of mirrors in certain corridors unsettled her more than the cameras did. This was a space designed to watch, not to reflect. Caleb behaved like a man returning to a place he already owned. He adjusted lighting presets, checked control panels, unlocked doors without hesitation. He poured her a drink without asking, remembered her preference from years ago rather than the one she had developed recently. The attention felt loving on the surface. Underneath, it felt like preparation. Outside, the storm accelerated. Wind bent the palms but did not break them. Rain arrived suddenly, violent and heavy, flattening the ocean into a single moving surface. Cell service vanished first. Internet followed. Caleb explained the outage calmly, nodding that the satellite backup was limited, reserved for essential communication. His devices remained connected. Hers did not. Madison realized then that isolation was not a risk. It was a feature. Dinner appeared with minimal effort. Food reheated from sealed containers, perfectly timed. Nothing cooked, nothing spontaneous. Caleb watched her eat with quiet attention, not possessive, just observant. When she asked about the final paperwork, the deal she believed was still pending, he deflected gently. There would be time. The storm would pass. This trip was about them. That was when the truth settled in fully. The island was not meant to test their marriage. It was meant to remove variables, distance, interference, witnesses. Whatever was broken between them was not going to be discussed here. It was going to be resolved by environment, by structure, by isolation. The island was not a destination. It was a controlled outcome. As night fell, the power flickered once, deliberately brief, just enough to remind her who controlled the systems. Emergency lighting activated automatically, bathing the rooms in a soft glow that erased sharp edges and depth perception. Caleb moved through the house, checking locks and panels not because he feared intrusion, but because he wanted confirmation. Madison lay awake later, listening to the storm batter the island and to the house responding in calm, measured adjustments. She thought about Caleb's foundation brochures, about images of clean water and grateful faces, about how easily control could be framed as care. Somewhere between midnight and morning, she accepted what her instincts had been trying to tell her since the descent began. The island had been bought in advance. And so had the ending. The route had been lost long before the yacht touched water. Madison realized that in the first moments after waking, when the world returned in fragments, salt on her tongue, sand ground into her palms, and a dull ringing that made the ocean sound like a distant engine. Her eyelids opened against gray light. The sky remained bruised with storm cloud, but the worst of the wind had moved on. What remained was heavier, humidity, silence, and the steady, indifferent breathing of waves. She tried to sit up and the movement sent pain across her ribs. Her dress clung to her skin as if it had been glued there. One shoe was missing. Her hair had dried into knots. Her hands shook when she pressed them into the sand and pushed. The shoreline around her was not the curated beach below the main house. It was raw and uneven, strewn with jagged coral fragments and driftwood, the kind of coast that cut ankles and swallowed footprints. The island's carefully maintained beauty had been left behind. Here, everything felt older than the deal, older than the houses, older than any plan Caleb had ever signed. Her first thought was that she had made a mistake by leaving. The morning before had been an argument without words. Caleb had moved through the house with contained energy, as if the storm had gifted him a more private version of the island. He had spoken in calm certainty about schedules returning to normal, about weather windows, about security and safety. His confidence had not matched the reality outside. The sea had remained aggressive. The sky had stayed stubbornly overcast. Madison had felt trapped in the polished rooms, monitored by cameras and comforted by nothing. So she had asked to see the far side of the island. The request had sounded harmless. Curiosity, restlessness, a need to walk in a place that did not feel like a showroom. Caleb had agreed too quickly. He had produced a set of keys and an itinerary like a man offering a compromise. The yacht had been waiting at the dock as if it had been booked for her alone. A small vessel, sleek and modern with a shallow draft to navigate reefs. It had felt excessive, but Caleb's world always did. Excess disguised itself as generosity. There had been no crew. Only an automated control console and a navigation tablet already powered on. Madison had noticed that the route was preloaded, a tidy line looping around the island with a stop near a distant inlet. She had assumed it was convenience. It had not occurred to her that convenience was another form of control, that a path can be drawn not to guide, but to limit. The sea had changed the moment she left the sheltered side. Waves sharpened into chop. Wind gusts returned like a delayed punishment. The yacht handled it well at first, its hull cutting through the water with practiced ease, but the sky grew darker faster than forecast. Rain returned in sheets, blurring horizon and coastline into a single gray mass. The tablet beeped with warnings. The route line stuttered and redrew itself. The GPS icon drifted, then snapped back, then drifted again. The storm interfered with signals, she told herself. It was nothing. Then the engine coughed. One hiccup, subtle but wrong. Then another, louder. The yacht's speed dropped. Madison moved toward the console, fingers stiff with cold and fear, and saw something that made her throat close. The fuel gauge did not read empty, but it did not read right either. It trembled between values as if the sensor could not decide. A warning message flashed about intake pressure, then vanished. The system acted like it had been tampered with and reset. She reached for the emergency radio. It turned on, then spat static, then returned to silence. The satellite uplink indicator glowed but refused to connect. She tried her phone anyway, though she already knew the island's dead zones and the house's selective connectivity. Nothing. The storm swallowed all attempts and left her with only the sound of the engines struggling and the sea building itself into something deliberate. When the wave hit, it felt less like nature and more like impact. The yacht lifted, tilted, then slammed down at an angle that threw Madison against the side rail. Pain exploded in her shoulder. The tablet flew from its mount. Another wave followed, and another, as if the sea had decided she would not pass. The yacht spun. She saw reef rock ahead, white foam curling over dark teeth, and she understood with sudden, useless clarity that the route was not merely failing. It was ending. The crash came with a grinding scream of fiberglass against coral. Water rushed in. The yacht lurched and settled crookedly, pinned. Madison tried to stand and was thrown again. The deck tilted, slick with rain. She reached for anything solid and found only wet metal and a railing that vibrated under pressure. The ocean kept striking, each wave shoving the boat further onto the reef as if trying to break it open. She remembered Caleb's hands on the key ring, the smoothness of his voice, the too easy permission to leave, the yacht waiting like it had been staged. Then the deck split. A sharp crack sounded beneath her feet, and the world became cold and white. She went over the side without meaning to. Salt water closed around her head, erasing sound and light. She fought upward, lungs burning, but the current dragged her sideways. Something hard struck her thigh. Another piece of reef caught her dress and tore it. She kicked free and reached for the surface that kept moving away. When she finally broke through, she gasped in air that tasted like rust and storm. The yacht was still there, but it looked smaller already, a toy being dismantled by waves. Madison saw the coastline, close enough to imagine she could reach it. She swam with desperate strokes, letting the current decide direction because fighting it would have killed her faster. She did not remember climbing out. She only remembered the moment her body stopped moving and the sand held her, and then darkness came like mercy. Now, awake again, she stared down the empty curve of beach and understood the second truth. The island did not intend to let her return easily. She tried to orient herself. The main complex had been on the opposite side, where the shore was smooth and the dock sat like an invitation. Here, the coastline was broken and hostile. Dense vegetation pressed close to the sand, a wall of green that looked almost black in the overcast light. No clear paths, no signs, no designed access. She stood unsteadily and looked for the yacht. It was gone. Only fragments remained. A floating cushion, a strip of white fiberglass bobbing in the shallows, and a smear of oil that rainbowed on the water's surface. The boat had not simply crashed, it had been consumed. Any chance of using it to signal or shelter was already dead. Madison's pulse jumped when she heard movement behind her. Not the sea, not the wind. A sound too controlled for nature. A footstep that avoided loose coral and chose sand. She turned sharply, heart hammering, scanning the edge of the trees. A man stood there, half in shadow. He was not dressed like staff. No uniform, no radio clipped to his belt, no polished shoes. He wore worn boots and dark pants, and a long-sleeved shirt that looked faded by sun and salt. His hair was dark, longer than most men kept it, pushed back from his face like someone who did not own a mirror. His stance was still, alert, angled slightly as if prepared to step back into the trees. He held no weapon that she could see, but his hands remained open and low, ready. Madison's body reacted before her mind did. She stepped back, then immediately regretted it when her foot hit a patch of sharp coral and pain flared. She hissed and steadied herself, refusing to show weakness in front of a stranger who belonged to this wild part of the island more than she did. The man's gaze moved over her quickly, assessing the injury, the torn dress, the bruise blooming along her shoulder. His expression did not soften. It also did not sharpen into cruelty. It held the blankness of someone who had learned to conserve emotion. He was close enough for her to see small details. A scar along his knuckles, salt crusted at the seams of his boots, and a faint line on his wrist that looked like an old burn or restraint mark. His eyes stayed on her face longer than necessary, as if deciding whether she was a threat, a problem, or something worse. Madison swallowed. The air felt too thick. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw and her voice came out weak, swallowed by distance. The man did not respond with words. He shifted his weight, looking briefly toward the water, then back to her, as if confirming something. He knew what had happened before she did. Madison took a step toward him, forcing herself into motion. She needed direction, shelter, anything. The man's posture tightened immediately, a subtle retreat. Distance was his first defense, not hostility, control. He did not want her close, and not because he feared her, because closeness meant contact. Contact meant involvement. Involvement meant consequences. Madison's mind jumped to Caleb, to security cameras, to patrols, to the caretaker's boat leaving too fast, to the selective satellite system. If this man was here, on the uncurated side of the island, then he was either part of Caleb's plan or outside it completely. His eyes flicked to her ring. She saw it happen, that small shift of attention, and felt something inside her tighten. The ring was Caleb's emblem as much as hers. White gold, understated, expensive, meant to signal stability without flash. The man's gaze did not linger in admiration. It lingered like recognition. Then he looked away, jaw set, and Madison understood. Whatever he knew, it was not good. She forced herself to move parallel to the trees, staying close to the open beach to keep sight lines. The sand was uneven and littered with debris thrown up by the storm. Every step hurt. Her foot bled. Her shoulder throbbed with each swing of her arm. The man followed at a distance, not approaching, not leaving. He moved like someone accustomed to staying unseen. When she stumbled, he did not rush to catch her, but he closed the gap enough to make sure she did not fall completely. When she stopped to breathe, he watched the tree line more than he watched her, scanning for threats she could not see. Madison's fear shifted. It was no longer only the fear of being lost. It became the fear of being found. The farther she walked, the more she noticed signs of old human presence hidden in the wild. A half-buried metal stake, a strip of plastic caught in roots, a faded marker that might have once been part of survey work. This side of the island was not untouched. It had been inspected, measured, and then abandoned as if deemed inconvenient, or useful only in secret. After nearly an hour, her legs weakened. Her skin burned where salt had dried. She needed water. She needed shade. The man finally moved ahead, disappearing into the trees without warning. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. Madison turned, scanning, her breath coming fast. The jungle pressed in, dense and silent. She imagined him vanishing and leaving her with nothing. She imagined being alone, truly alone, in a place where the shore could not lead her home. Then he reappeared, holding a narrow flask. He did not hand it to her directly. He set it on a flat rock between them, then stepped back again. The gesture was controlled, almost ritualistic, offer without closeness, help without permission for intimacy. Madison stared at the flask as if it might be poisoned, then hated herself for thinking like that while her throat screamed for water. She lifted it carefully, sniffed, then drank. The water was cool, faintly metallic but real. She drank too fast and coughed, choking on relief. When she lowered the flask, her hands were steadier. The man watched her with the same unreadable calm. Madison returned the flask to the rock. She wanted to ask his name, to demand answers, to insist he help her get back. But she sensed that pushing would make him disappear again. His distance was not cruelty. It was armor. She pointed toward the shoreline, then toward herself, then toward the horizon as if asking how to get back. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He shook his head once. A simple refusal. Then he gestured inland, toward a narrow opening between thick roots and tangled vines. Madison's stomach dropped. Inland meant jungle. Jungle meant uncertainty. But the beach ahead looked worse. Sharp rocks, cliffs rising, water slamming into stone. The coastline did not offer a path. It offered injury. She hesitated. The man waited, motionless, as if he had all day. As if time was something he could afford and she could not. Madison stepped toward the opening. The air immediately changed, cooler under the canopy, damp and heavy with rot and green life. The ground softened into soil and leaf litter. Insects hummed. Something small moved quickly in the underbrush. Madison's skin prickled. She followed, because there was no other choice. The man moved ahead, silent, careful. He did not clear branches for her, but he did choose a route that avoided the worst thorns and the deepest mud. He knew where roots were stable. He knew which leaves would conceal holes. He knew the island in a way that no official map ever could. After some time, Madison realized something else. He was not bringing her to the main complex. He was bringing her somewhere he controlled. They emerged into a small clearing hidden beneath tangled canopy. A crude shelter stood there, built low to the ground with weathered wood and woven palm. It was not a tourist hut. It was not part of any resort plan. It was survival architecture, functional, invisible from above. Inside, the floor was lined with dried leaves and a tarp. A small fire pit sat cold in the center. Supplies were stacked neatly. Canned food, rope, a battered first aid kit. Evidence of long-term existence. Madison looked at the shelter, then at the man, and felt a strange, unwanted shift in power. On the beach, she had still been near open sky. Here she was inside his territory. He crouched near the first aid kit, pulled out antiseptic and gauze, and held them up briefly, indicating her foot. Madison's pride rose. Her fear rose higher. But pain decided for her. She sat on a flat stone and extended her injured foot. He approached slowly, still cautious, as if the distance between them was dangerous even when it was necessary. His hands were steady. He cleaned the wound without gentleness but without brutality, efficient, practiced. When Madison flinched, his grip tightened slightly to keep her still. Not dominance, not comfort, control. The kind you used when comfort could be mistaken for permission. She watched his face while he worked. He did not look at her eyes. He looked at the injury, then at his hands, then briefly at the tree line again, as if expecting interruption. His silence felt heavy, intentional. Madison realized he was not just a man living off the grid. He was hiding. When he finished, he wrapped her foot securely and stepped away immediately, as if the contact had burned him. Madison tried again to speak, shaping questions she did not know how to ask. Who was he? Why was he here? How long? How to get back? The man's jaw flexed. He looked at the ring again, and something in his expression finally shifted, an emotion breaking through the practiced blankness. It was not longing. It was something darker. Memory sharpened into resentment. He turned and walked to the edge of the clearing, where a piece of metal was half buried under leaves. He dragged it into view. It was a broken sign, corroded, letters barely visible. Madison leaned forward and made out enough to understand it had once belonged to a corporation, not a resort brand, something industrial, something that had been here before the island became a dream of luxury. A symbol, faint but recognizable, matched the embossed mark on Caleb's folder, the one he never let out of his hand. Madison's blood cooled. The man, finally, looked directly at her. His eyes held warning, accusation, and something that unsettled her most, certainty. As if he had been waiting for someone like her to wash up here again. As if the island's uglier history always resurfaced, no matter how carefully it was buried. Madison understood then that her accident was not merely a detour. It was an intersection. The tension between them did not feel romantic. It felt primal. Two people forced into proximity by circumstance, each a threat to the other in different ways. She was the wife of the man who owned this place, the emblem of power and polished cruelty. He was the ghost living inside the island's forgotten corners, the consequence of something Caleb's world had done and then erased. Madison needed him to return. He needed her not to belong. The route back to the main house was not lost on a map. It was lost in intention. And as the canopy darkened and the air thickened with approaching night, Madison felt the truth settle in with brutal clarity. Whatever Caleb had planned for the island, someone else had survived it. And now Madison was in the wrong part of paradise, with the kind of stranger who did not rescue people out of kindness, but out of necessity. The storm returned without warning, not with thunder but with pressure, as if the sky had lowered itself closer to the ground. The air thickened first. Then the wind followed, threading through the jungle with a low, persistent howl. Ethan noticed the change before Madison did. He paused mid-step, listening not to sound but to absence, to the way insects went quiet and leaves stopped moving independently. The island was gathering itself again. They did not have time to reach the shoreline or the main paths. Madison's injured foot slowed her, and the ground had begun to slick over with fresh rain. Ethan altered course sharply, guiding them through a break in the undergrowth toward a structure Madison had not seen before. It rose from the trees like a forgotten thought, low, rectangular, half swallowed by vines and rust. Concrete walls bore the stains of salt and age. A steel door hung crookedly on one hinge, scarred by corrosion and impact. It was not a shelter meant for people anymore. It had once been technical, functional, part of the island's older infrastructure. A relay station or monitoring outpost, built back when the island had been surveyed for purposes far less glamorous than luxury. Caleb's world liked to pretend this phase had never existed. Inside, the building smelled of damp metal and old oil. Rain hammered against the roof almost immediately after they crossed the threshold, loud enough to erase the jungle beyond the walls. Water leaked through cracks, running in thin streams down the concrete. Light filtered in through narrow slits near the ceiling, turning the interior gray and enclosed. Madison lowered herself onto a crate without asking. Her leg throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache that traveled upward, tightening her muscles and stealing breath. The adrenaline that had carried her through the jungle began to drain, leaving behind weakness and cold. She wrapped her arms around herself and focused on staying upright. Ethan moved with restrained efficiency. He cleared debris from a corner, dragged another crate closer, and laid out supplies he had brought from the shelter. Everything he did was deliberate, economical. He did not rush to her side. He gave her space as if proximity itself carried risk. When he finally knelt near her injured foot, the closeness felt abrupt despite the care he took. His presence filled the narrow space in a way that made Madison acutely aware of her own body. Not desire, vulnerability. She had never felt so exposed without being physically uncovered. He removed the makeshift bandage he had applied earlier and inspected the wound again. The skin around it had swollen and darkened. The storm's dampness had not helped. He cleaned it thoroughly, his touch firm and precise, fingers steady even when she tensed. There was no tenderness in the way people offered comfort. There was competence, attention, the kind of care that came from necessity rather than affection. Madison watched his hands instead of his face. She noticed how he never let his skin linger against hers longer than required, how he adjusted his position to avoid unnecessary contact. Each movement communicated restraint, not indifference, but discipline. The building groaned as wind pressed against its walls. Somewhere outside, something heavy struck metal and rolled away. Madison flinched, and Ethan's shoulders tightened in response. He was listening beyond the noise, tracking possibilities. She realized then that he did not feel safer inside than outside. This was simply a lesser exposure. He finished securing her foot and stood, increasing the distance between them again. The gap felt intentional, maintained like a boundary neither of them had named. As the storm intensified, Madison's thoughts turned inward. The isolation pressed against her mind as much as the walls pressed against her body. There were no cameras here, no assistants, no carefully modulated environments designed to keep her calm and compliant. For the first time in months, perhaps years, nothing around her was curated. Ethan took out a small flashlight and checked the corners of the building, the door, the narrow windows. When he returned to his spot near the wall, Madison noticed his gaze lingering briefly on her face before shifting away again. His expression remained guarded, but something underneath it had softened, fractured by proximity. Time stretched. The storm showed no sign of moving on quickly. Madison broke the silence not with words but with movement. She adjusted her posture, trying to relieve the pressure in her leg, and hissed quietly when pain spiked. Ethan reacted instantly, stepping closer before stopping himself halfway, as if remembering a rule he had imposed. The hesitation was subtle but unmistakable. She saw it, the conflict. That moment changed something between them. Madison began to notice patterns, the way he flinched at certain sounds, the way his attention sharpened when she mentioned the main house earlier, even in passing, the way his jaw tightened when she unconsciously referred to the island as belonging to Caleb. Ethan did not correct her, but the tension it caused lingered. She began to understand that his silence was not emptiness. It was containment. The storm forced stillness. With nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait, Madison's awareness expanded into the space between them. She studied the building and saw traces of a story written into its decay. Old markings on the wall indicated equipment placements. Burn marks suggested an electrical failure long ago. A faded serial number matched the industrial signage she had glimpsed in the jungle. This place had not been abandoned by accident. It had been erased. Ethan noticed her attention on the markings. His posture changed, shoulders drawing back slightly, chin lifting as if bracing for impact. He did not stop her from looking. He simply endured it. Madison followed the thread inward, connecting it to memories she had tried not to examine too closely. Caleb's early projects. The lawsuits settled quietly. The environmental impact reports that had been rewritten, softened, buried. The non-disclosure agreements signed by people whose names never appeared in the press. She had known in an abstract way that harm existed. Wealth always left a shadow. But here, inside a crumbling structure swallowed by vines, that abstraction sharpened into something personal, something human. Ethan was not just someone living off-grid. He was evidence. The realization did not make her pull away. It did the opposite. It made his presence heavier, more real. He was not a stranger by chance. He was here because of choices made in rooms she had sat in, beside a man she had married. Madison shifted again, discomfort forcing her to move. This time, Ethan closed the distance fully. He crouched beside her, bracing her leg more securely with a folded cloth, adjusting her position to reduce strain. His hands were warm despite the damp air. The contact was brief but grounding. She felt it immediately. Not attraction, but recognition. The awareness of being seen not as a role, not as an extension of someone else's power, but as a physical, breathing person with pain and limits. Ethan withdrew again, but the space between them no longer felt empty. It felt charged. As the storm raged, Madison's breathing slowed. The constant vigilance she carried in Caleb's presence eased slightly. She was not being evaluated here, not managed, not guided toward a desired outcome. Ethan did not offer reassurance. He did not try to distract her. He simply stayed alert, present, and real. That, more than anything, unsettled her. At some point, fatigue overtook her. Her head dipped forward, then jerked back up as she caught herself. Ethan noticed and moved closer, positioning himself so she could lean against the wall without strain. He did not touch her, but he made the space safer by his presence alone. Madison allowed her eyes to close briefly. In that fragile half-sleep, memories surfaced uninvited. Boardrooms, private jets, smiling photographs taken at the right angles. Caleb's hand on her back, guiding her through rooms, conversations, decisions. She had been valuable because she fit, because she reflected stability, trust, legitimacy. Here, stripped of that context, she felt something unfamiliar. Uselessness, perhaps, or honesty. When she opened her eyes again, Ethan was watching the door, muscles taut, attention fixed outward. He did not look at her unless necessary. The restraint was no longer just discipline. It was protection, for both of them. Madison understood then that closeness itself was dangerous. Not because of desire, but because of what it might force into the open. If Ethan spoke, he would confirm what she had begun to suspect. If he stayed silent, she would continue to connect the pieces herself. Either way, the truth pressed closer with every shared minute. The storm eventually softened into steady rain. The building's echoes faded. Outside, the island exhaled, though the air remained heavy. Ethan rose and checked the surroundings again. When he returned, his gaze met Madison's briefly, directly, without deflection. The look held no accusation. It held recognition. She was not an object here, not a wife, not an asset. She was a liability. And so was he. That understanding formed the core of their emerging bond. Not romance. Not yet. Something darker and more dangerous. A connection forged not through confession or touch, but through shared awareness of a truth that could not be safely spoken. Madison knew that when the storm passed, nothing would return to its previous shape. Not her marriage, not the island, not the distance between her and the man who had become both her shelter and her threat. Inside the abandoned building, surrounded by the remnants of a buried past, closeness became a form of exposure. And exposure, she realized, was the first step toward choosing a side. The first sign that the island had been reclaimed was not a helicopter blade or a distant engine. It was the sudden, unnatural silence of the jungle, as if the foliage itself had been instructed to hold its breath. Then came a sound that did not belong to weather or wildlife. The clean snap of a branch broken with purpose, followed by measured footsteps that did not hesitate, did not search, did not wander. Someone was approaching as if the location had already been confirmed. Madison felt it before she saw him. The air shifted. The fragile, tense balance inside the abandoned station cracked. Ethan's posture changed in a single instant, spine tightening, shoulders drawing back, his attention narrowing like a blade. He did not move toward the door. He did not reach for anything. He simply became still, the way a hunted animal went quiet when it realized hiding was no longer an option. The door creaked, and light spilled in behind a silhouette framed by rain and gray sky. Caleb stepped inside with the same composure he carried into gala rooms and board meetings, as if the island, the storm, and the decay were merely inconvenient decor. His clothes looked too clean for the jungle, too controlled for the conditions. Even damp, he appeared curated. His hair was set. His expression was calm. His eyes found Madison first, and in the space of a heartbeat, relief was displayed with perfect timing, as though it had been practiced in advance. He moved toward her at a careful pace, not rushing, not panicking, his body language offering safety while his gaze quietly cataloged everything in the room. The crates, the improvised bandage, the distance between Madison and Ethan, the fact that she was upright and breathing and that someone else had kept her that way. Madison expected to feel saved. Instead, something colder slid down her spine, a sensation she could not name at first. It was not fear of the storm anymore. It was the recognition of a familiar atmosphere, the one that always formed around Caleb when he was about to take control of a narrative. He reached her and checked her injury with a brief, precise glance, the way he evaluated risks. The concern in his face appeared and vanished in controlled increments, perfectly aligned with what a husband was supposed to show. His hands touched her arm lightly, just enough to mark possession as care. Madison noticed that even this was measured. He was not holding her because he needed her close. He was holding her because it established a frame, the husband recovering his wife. Only after that frame was secured did his attention shift to Ethan. Caleb's gaze landed on him with polite neutrality, the expression of a man acknowledging a service provider. His features did not harden. He did not show open hostility. He appeared grateful, composed, diplomatic. Yet the air in the room tightened as if pressure had been increased. The building felt smaller, and Madison realized the change had nothing to do with walls. Ethan's face remained unreadable, but his body reacted in subtle ways Madison had begun to recognize. A slight retreat of weight onto the back foot, the smallest tightening at the jaw, an invisible barrier rising between him and Caleb that did not require words. Caleb's manner stayed immaculate. He offered acknowledgement in the form of calm nods and measured gestures, the kind that suggested reasonableness. He signaled that no conflict was necessary, that the situation could be resolved quietly, that gratitude would be expressed, compensation arranged, any complications erased. Madison saw the trap inside the courtesy. Caleb did not ask Ethan who he was. He did not appear surprised by his presence. There was no visible confusion, no startled recalculation. He behaved as if Ethan's existence was already part of the equation, already accounted for as an irregularity that could be contained. That realization hit Madison like a second storm. Caleb had not stumbled upon them. He had found them. The thought rearranged the last hours into a different shape. The timing. The way help had arrived only after the worst was already survived. The way the storm's chaos had created a perfect pocket of isolation. The way the island, supposedly empty, suddenly produced a rescuer with resources and certainty. Caleb looked at the building as if it offended him. The rust, the damp, the exposure. He did not like spaces he did not control. He glanced at the narrow windows, the cracked concrete, the exposed wiring remnants. His eyes lingered on the faded industrial markings. Madison watched him watch them, and she saw a flicker of something behind his calm. Recognition, not curiosity. He had seen this place before in documents, in reports, in early-phase plans, maybe in photographs attached to a legal file that had never reached court. Caleb turned back to Madison, and the gentleness returned like a mask sliding into place. He signaled that they would leave immediately, that she would be taken somewhere warmer, cleaner, safer, somewhere private. Somewhere the island's staff could be managed, the situation reframed, the outside world kept at a distance. The main house was not just shelter. It was a controlled environment, a stage. Madison felt the instinct to resist, but it rose in her throat and stalled, because resisting Caleb was never a simple act. It was not a single refusal. It was a confrontation with the entire system that had been built around his will. The resources, the surveillance, the people who obeyed without needing to be told. Ethan stepped back as Caleb prepared to move her. The retreat was not dramatic. It was economical, almost respectful. Yet Madison sensed what it meant. He was removing himself because he understood what came next. His role in the survival story had reached its limit. In Caleb's presence, Ethan was not a helper. He was a witness. Madison's gaze followed Ethan, and in that glance she saw something she had not expected. Not pleading, not fear, but a kind of resigned calculation. He had lived long enough on this island to recognize the patterns of power. He knew how quickly a man like Caleb could turn gratitude into a weapon. Caleb supported Madison as they left the building, guiding her out into the wet air. His grip was firm but careful, a demonstration of care with ownership stitched into it. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, but the jungle still glistened with danger. Madison's body leaned into Caleb for balance, and she hated how easily it fit the picture he wanted. They walked through the trees, and the island felt different with Caleb present. The paths seemed clearer. The movement felt directed. Madison noticed subtle signs she had missed before. A cut vine here, a broken branch there, a faint imprint of boots in mud too fresh to be old. Someone had been moving through the jungle recently. Someone had been tracking. When they reached the edge of a cleared area, the proof became undeniable. A small team waited near an off-road vehicle, dressed in practical gear that looked like it belonged to security rather than resort staff. They did not speak loudly. They did not display emotion. They watched Caleb for cues. Their presence was quiet, but it radiated capability. Caleb had brought people. Madison's mind tightened around that fact. This was not a desperate search by a worried husband. This was retrieval. She was placed into the vehicle with controlled efficiency. A blanket appeared, water, a medical kit. Everything delivered quickly, almost seamlessly, as if the storm had been anticipated, the logistics prepared. Caleb remained beside her, one hand near her knee, close enough to reassure, close enough to anchor the narrative of devotion. Ethan was guided to another seat, slightly apart, not openly restrained but subtly isolated. The security team did not treat him like a guest. Their eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. Their posture angled in ways that suggested containment. Caleb did not correct them. He did not need to. The ride to the main house cut through private paths that Madison had not known existed. The jungle blurred past, and the island's manicured sections emerged. Trimmed edges, prepared lighting, the distant outline of structures that looked like luxury against the wild. The transition felt like crossing between realities. Madison's stomach tightened as the main building came into view, pristine and bright despite the weather, standing as if untouched by the storm that had torn the coast apart. Inside, the air was cool, filtered, scented. The contrast was jarring. Staff moved quickly, quietly, their faces composed. No one asked questions. No one showed surprise at Madison's state. It was as though the entire house had been briefed already. Caleb guided her into a private room, arranged for comfort with a precision that felt invasive. Dry clothes were offered, warm towels, a medical check. He remained present for each step, attentive, gentle, steady. Yet Madison could not stop noticing the way his eyes tracked the process, the way he absorbed details like data. He was not just caring for her, he was managing variables. Ethan was not brought into the same space. Madison caught a glimpse of him through a corridor as security moved him toward a separate area. The distance between them widened quickly, intentionally. Caleb did not allow the line of sight to remain open for long. When Madison's injury was addressed and her body warmed, Caleb finally shifted into the next phase, containment of the story. He made calls from a nearby room, his voice low and calm, never rising, never breaking. Madison could hear fragments through the walls, references to the storm, to safety, to responsibility. He spoke as if explaining a minor inconvenience. He sounded like a man already composing the official version. Madison sat on the bed and tried to piece together what was happening with the clarity of someone watching her own life from outside. She knew Caleb's public persona well. Philanthropist, investor, man of integrity who funded environmental initiatives while building luxury projects that promised sustainability. He knew how to speak the language of care while pursuing control. On this island, stripped of the city's distractions, she saw him more sharply. He returned to her with the same gentle expression, as if nothing complicated existed outside the room. He checked her face, her temperature, her foot. He offered reassurance through presence rather than words. He looked like a husband who had been terrified and was now grateful. The picture was flawless. That was what frightened her. Later, as the storm's aftereffects continued and reports began to circulate beyond the island, Caleb expanded the narrative outward. Authorities were contacted in a manner that suggested cooperation, transparency, concern for safety. Yet Madison noticed the careful phrasing, the way Caleb positioned himself at the center of the account. The organizer, the responsible party, the one who had taken all necessary measures. He emphasized the danger of the storm, the unpredictability, the unfortunate accident. He left out what he did not want included. Ethan's presence was described in terms that reduced him, an unknown man, an unauthorized individual, a possible trespasser, someone who had been found on private property during an emergency. Caleb never called him a savior. He did not lie outright. He simply shaped the language so that the conclusion formed on its own in other people's minds. Madison listened and felt her mouth go dry. She understood the mechanics of it. Caleb did not need to accuse Ethan directly. He only needed to introduce doubt. Doubt became suspicion. Suspicion became justification, and justification allowed removal. She asked to see Ethan, not as a plea but as a test. Caleb's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, a quick narrowing that was gone before it could be measured. He signaled delay, not refusal. He framed it as practical, safety, procedure, rest. Madison recognized that tactic too. It was how he softened control into concern. Time passed in a strange, suspended way. The island remained cut off, partly by weather, partly by Caleb's decisions. Staff moved like a well-trained organism. Doors remained closed when Madison approached. Security lingered in corridors with the quiet patience of men paid to wait. Madison began to realize that her rescue was not the end of a crisis. It was the beginning of a new one. She moved through the house slowly on her injured foot, using the architecture as cover. The main building was designed to impress guests, but now its luxury felt like a cage. She found a window overlooking a side courtyard and saw Ethan below, standing near a fence line as security spoke with him. He did not struggle. He did not plead. He stood with stillness that looked like control from a distance but felt, to Madison, like someone measuring how far the walls extended. Caleb appeared behind her without sound, his presence arriving as if summoned by her attention. Madison did not turn immediately. She felt him there, close enough to claim the space. The room's air tightened again, and she understood that even her gaze was monitored. Even her thoughts could be predicted. That was the moment the truth became unavoidable. She was not simply a wife in an accident scenario. She was a role in a script. Caleb had always written scripts, public events, charity campaigns, media narratives. He knew exactly which images made people soften and which details made them stop asking questions. Now he was writing one about her, the fragile wife saved by her devoted husband during a storm, protected from danger, brought back to comfort. The island as a symbol of their shared future. The crisis as a test they survived together. Ethan did not belong in that story. He was an uncontrolled element, a man with knowledge, a man connected to Caleb's past, a man whose presence introduced the possibility of another narrative, one where Caleb was not the hero. Madison felt a pressure building inside her chest, the quiet panic of realizing she had been living inside someone else's authored reality. She saw the patterns she had once excused, the way Caleb isolated her from conflict by removing options, the way he called it protection, the way he framed her doubts as stress, fatigue, misunderstanding. He did not need to chain her. He only needed to ensure every path led back to him. Now the island made that system visible. There was nowhere else to go. Caleb's calm remained intact as he continued to arrange things. A boat schedule, a medical evacuation plan that was postponed and then postponed again. Communication with authorities filtered through his team. Updates delivered to Madison only after decisions were already made. The feeling of being carried by someone's care turned into the sickening sense of being moved like an asset. Ethan was kept close enough to be controlled, far enough to be unreachable. Madison's mind kept returning to the abandoned station. The way Ethan had reacted to Caleb's approach. The way Caleb had shown no surprise. The way the security team had arrived too clean, too prepared. The realization sharpened into something she could no longer ignore. Caleb had known Ethan was on the island. Perhaps he had been searching for him long before the storm. Perhaps this trip had always carried a second purpose beneath the honeymoon narrative. The thought made her stomach turn. When Caleb finally allowed Madison outside under the pretense of fresh air, she felt the house's boundaries more clearly. 2 guards remained within sight. Staff remained nearby. The island's beauty, once seductive, now looked staged and sterile. Everything was too arranged, too owned. She saw Ethan again at a distance, being moved toward a smaller outbuilding near the property's edge. His head turned briefly, and his gaze met hers through rain-softened air. There was no pleading in his eyes. There was warning. Madison understood it without words. If she stayed passive, the story would be finalized without her. Ethan would become the villain or disappear entirely, and she would be returned to her place as Caleb's wife, grateful and quiet, convinced it had all been for her own good. She stood in the damp air and felt something inside her fracture into clarity. Her rescue had been designed to look like love. Her comfort had been designed to look like safety. Even her fear had been anticipated and used as leverage. Caleb had returned not as a savior, but as an owner reclaiming what had wandered outside his control. And Madison realized, with a cold certainty that settled beneath her skin, that the island had been bought long before the papers were signed. It had been bought as a stage, as a cage, as a place where the right version of events could be manufactured and the wrong witnesses could be erased. The storm had not trapped her here by accident. It had simply provided the perfect excuse. The first thing Madison noticed was that the house had become quieter, not because the storm had passed, but because movement had been reduced on purpose. Doors that used to stay open now clicked shut behind her. Hallways that once felt merely large now felt supervised. Even the air conditioning seemed tuned to a colder, steadier temperature, as if warmth might encourage comfort, and comfort might invite questions. Caleb did not announce new rules. He did not need to. He introduced them the way he introduced everything else, as improvements, as protection, as common sense. The restriction began with small adjustments that sounded reasonable. A staff member insisted on carrying her tray. A guard offered an umbrella and then remained close. Someone suggested she rest instead of walking, as if her ankle were more fragile than it actually was. Every suggestion became a pattern. Every pattern became a boundary. At first, Madison tried to interpret it the way she always had, because interpreting Caleb generously had once been her survival skill. She told herself the island was still recovering from the storm, that protocols were necessary, that Caleb's security team was simply cautious. Yet her body registered the truth faster than her mind. She stopped breathing fully when footsteps approached her door. She began listening for the soft pause in the corridor that meant someone was standing outside, waiting, not for danger, but for her to make a choice. Caleb's attentiveness intensified in the same measured increments. He checked on her more often. He brought her tea she had not asked for, arranged meals at exact times, and ensured she was never alone long enough to sink into silence. His care was not explosive or dramatic. It was steady, polished, and constant, like a hand resting on her shoulder that never truly lifted. And then the papers appeared. They arrived without urgency. A slim folder placed on a side table beside a vase of white flowers. No announcement, no dramatic request, just an object introduced into the environment, waiting to be acknowledged. Madison saw the folder and felt the same cold ripple she had felt in the technical station when Caleb had stepped through the door, that recognition of a script being staged around her. The documents were not a single contract. They were a sequence of confirmations, revised ownership structures, updated liability waivers, amended insurance statements, signatures needed for expedited processing due to unforeseen circumstances. Words that sounded neutral, legal, almost boring. Yet the overall shape of the paperwork was unmistakable. It was consolidation. It was control made legitimate with ink. Caleb presented the folder to her with the same tone he used when discussing charity events and investment opportunities. He framed it as a shared step, a marital task, a burden he wanted to carry with her rather than alone. The language of partnership wrapped itself around the request like velvet. Madison did not sign. She delayed, not out of open defiance, but because she needed time to understand exactly what she was being asked to surrender. Caleb did not press immediately. He did not show irritation. He allowed her a day, then another. He increased warmth rather than force, making himself more pleasant, more attentive, more patient. The patience felt like a tightening noose because it suggested certainty. He was not worried about her refusal. He assumed it would become compliance eventually. Madison tried to find Ethan. She began by asking for him indirectly, watching staff reactions more than their words. She noted which eyes flickered away, which hands tightened around trays, which bodies angled to block certain hallways. She felt the house's design become a map of permitted and forbidden spaces. The further she drifted from Caleb's presence, the more quickly someone appeared to redirect her. She attempted to use the only advantage she had left, being underestimated. She moved slowly on her injured ankle, letting people believe she could not go far. She smiled when necessary. She expressed gratitude. She asked for water, for towels, for nothing that mattered. She waited for small gaps in supervision. She learned the rhythm of shift changes. She learned which guard grew bored at his post and which one took pride in watching everything. She found no trace of Ethan in the main house, not even the subtle evidence of a guest passing through. No cup left on a counter. No damp footprints near a door. No mention in the staff's casual murmurs. It was as though he had never been there. That absence was more terrifying than any argument could have been. A conflict would have confirmed he still existed within the island's narrative. Silence suggested removal. One afternoon, when Caleb was occupied with calls and the house settled into its controlled calm, a small disturbance appeared where Madison would notice it. It was not dramatic. It was a detail placed like a pin in fabric. A maintenance panel near the back service corridor left slightly ajar, the screw not fully tightened. The kind of oversight that did not happen in a house run by Caleb's standards unless someone had wanted it to happen. Madison stared at the panel for a long time. She told herself it meant nothing. Then she told herself it meant everything. She waited until the corridor emptied. She moved carefully, suppressing the pain in her ankle, focusing on the sound of her own breath. The panel opened with minimal resistance, as if it had been prepared. Behind it was not wiring, not pipes, not the expected architecture of a luxury building. It was a narrow cavity with a sealed envelope pressed against the interior wall, held in place by tape. The envelope carried no name, no instructions, only a faint mark on the corner, a small symbol drawn in graphite that Madison recognized with a jolt. The same subtle shape Ethan had carved into wood near the shelter, a simple angled line intersected by a second, like a warning sign or a compass point. Her hands shook as she pulled the envelope free. Inside were photocopied pages, photographs, and a small storage card sealed in a plastic sleeve. The paper smelled faintly of damp, as if it had been hidden outdoors before being moved into the house. Madison's mind tried to reject what she was seeing because it did not fit the life she had been living. Yet her body understood the weight of it immediately. This was not a note. It was evidence. The first pages were reports. Not headlines, not public summaries, but internal documents with corporate logos, signatures, and redacted sections. There were references to an incident years earlier, a coastal acquisition, a chemical spill disguised as equipment malfunction, a settlement paid quietly to families who signed non-disclosure agreements. There was a list of names, and beside them, numbers that looked like compensation amounts, arranged like a ledger rather than a memorial. The photographs were worse. They showed shoreline damage, dead wildlife, damaged boats, workers in protective gear. In one image, a man stood with his face turned away, posture tense, as if resisting being photographed. Madison recognized the shape of his shoulders, the angle of his neck. Ethan. A second set of papers included legal correspondence, dates, and a summary of charges that had never been filed. The language was careful, as if written by lawyers who knew exactly how to document wrongdoing without calling it what it was. The conclusion was implicit. The corporation had done this, and Caleb had ensured it disappeared. Madison sat on the floor beside the open panel, the envelope spread across her lap, and felt her throat tighten until breathing became deliberate. She had known Caleb was capable of ruthlessness in business. She had seen him cut people out of deals without hesitation. She had watched him smile while dismantling competitors. But this was not business aggression. This was damage. This was death packaged as inconvenience. She understood why Ethan had lived on the island like a ghost rather than returning to the world. She understood why he had reacted to Caleb's arrival with that sudden stillness. Ethan had not been afraid of a confrontation. He had been afraid of being erased again. The storage card was the final blade. Madison found an old laptop in a guest office and inserted the card with hands that had gone numb. The files were organized with brutal simplicity: video clips, audio fragments, scanned documents, a timeline. She opened one clip and saw Caleb in a setting that was not a gala or a conference. He was on a dock at night, speaking to someone out of frame. His voice was calm. His posture was relaxed. The lighting was harsh and unflattering. The man in the video did not look like the philanthropist the public adored. He looked like a man used to issuing quiet orders. Madison did not need to hear every word to understand the tone. Even without perfect audio, she recognized the cadence, the same one he used when he thought something was already decided. She closed the laptop, her stomach turning, because the evidence did not only indict Caleb, it implicated her. Not legally, perhaps, but morally in a way that felt worse. She had stood beside him for years while he built his reputation. She had attended events where his generosity was praised. She had smiled in photographs that strengthened his image. She had been part of the camouflage. Now she understood why the island felt sterile, like a set. It had been designed not only for luxury, but for control. It was a private kingdom where consequences could be managed and narratives could be rewritten. A place where people could disappear and the world would never know. Madison returned the envelope to her room in pieces, hiding the papers under clothing, the card in the lining of a travel bag. She moved carefully, forcing her face into neutrality. She understood that knowledge changed everything, and that Caleb would sense the shift even if she said nothing. He did not need confession. He needed patterns. He would detect the smallest deviation in her behavior like a shark detecting blood. That evening, Caleb was gentler than usual. He brought dinner himself rather than allowing staff to do it. He sat near her on the edge of the bed and adjusted the blanket around her legs with an intimacy that would have seemed tender to an outsider. He watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with a quiet evaluation disguised as affection. Madison realized he was reading her the way he read markets, looking for volatility, for weakness, for openings. His touch was warm, his gaze was steady, his demeanor suggested devotion. Yet Madison felt, beneath the surface, the same truth Ethan had left her. Caleb's love was ownership made poetic. The folder of documents returned to the foreground. It was placed closer this time, within easy reach. Caleb did not demand her signature outright. He simply positioned the request as inevitable, as if refusing would be irrational. He offered her the kind of calm that made resistance feel like madness. He made it seem as though compliance would restore peace. Madison considered what peace meant in Caleb's world. It meant quiet. It meant obedience. It meant no witnesses. She thought of Ethan's disappearance and felt the cold clarity settle deeper. If Ethan was gone, it was not because he had chosen to vanish. It was because Caleb had moved him out of the story. The question was whether Ethan was hidden somewhere alive, waiting, or whether Caleb had already decided the ending. Madison's mind began to map possibilities the way she had once mapped social obligations. She counted exits. She identified blind spots. She estimated the distance between the main house and the shore. She remembered the security team's equipment: satellite phones, radios, weapons carried discreetly. She remembered the storm's damage: boats delayed, routes unstable, the island's isolation still partially intact. Caleb's greatest advantage was that the island belonged to him, not only legally but operationally. He controlled the people. He controlled movement. He controlled the information leaving the property. Madison's greatest disadvantage was that she was supposed to be grateful. She recognized the trap in her own emotions. Part of her still wanted to believe Caleb could be persuaded, that his control came from fear, that love could be redirected into something healthier. That part of her was the last remnant of the woman who had married him. It was soft, hopeful, and dangerous. The evidence made that softness feel like a liability. It showed her what Caleb did when he was challenged. He did not negotiate with threats to his order. He removed them. She imagined herself as the next variable to be managed. She imagined her attempting to leave and being framed as unstable, injured, emotionally compromised after trauma. She imagined him calling authorities with concern, reporting her as confused, frightened, irrational. He would not need to lock her in a room. He would only need to make the world believe she belonged under his protection. The golden cage did not require bars if everyone agreed she should stay inside it. Late that night, Madison left her room for the first time without a clear excuse. She moved through the corridor with her ankle wrapped tightly, the pain sharpened by each step. She felt eyes on her even when she did not see them. The house seemed to breathe with quiet surveillance. She reached a side entrance and slipped outside into the humid darkness. The storm clouds had thinned, leaving a damp sky with occasional stars. The island smelled of wet earth and salt. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean churned softly, constant and indifferent. Madison walked along the edge of the property, keeping to shadows, listening for footsteps behind her. She did not know what she was searching for exactly. Proof that Ethan still existed. A sign that he had a plan. Or perhaps she needed to test the boundaries, to feel with her own body how far she could go before the cage revealed itself. Near the service buildings, she found another mark. It was etched into the metal of a utility door, faint but deliberate, the same intersecting lines as before. Her breath caught. She pressed her fingers to it, feeling the grooves. Ethan had been here recently, or someone had wanted her to believe he had. The door was locked, but the lock was old, and the frame showed signs of recent handling, like a tool had been used and then removed carefully. Madison did not force it. She did not have time. She had already stayed outside too long. She returned to the main house with her heart pounding, and her thoughts sharpened into a single, unbearable conclusion. She could not wait. Waiting was what Caleb wanted. Waiting would allow him to finish cleaning up loose ends. Waiting would allow the island to become fully operational again, with boats arriving, staff returning, the storm used as an excuse for any missing pieces. Waiting would allow him to decide what to do with the evidence, with Ethan, with her. Madison reached her room and locked the door, though she knew locks meant little in a house where keys were controlled by someone else. She sat on the floor and pulled the envelope back out, rereading the papers until the names blurred. She did not do it to gather information. She did it to steady herself with truth, because truth was the only thing Caleb could not rewrite inside her if she held it firmly enough. She understood her choice in full shape now, not as melodrama, but as an equation. If she stayed, Caleb would eventually smooth everything into normal. He would apologize when it benefited him. He would promise change. He would offer affection, gifts, travel, new beginnings. He would build a life around her that looked flawless from the outside. He would protect her from the world, and in doing so, he would ensure she never left him. She would survive, but she would become smaller each year, until she existed only as a reflection of his image. If she ran, she might lose everything. She might be hunted. She might be framed. She might be physically stopped before she reached the shore. She might fail. Yet there was one thing running offered that staying never could: the possibility of being real again, even if it cost her comfort. The decision did not arrive as a burst of courage. It arrived as a cold alignment of facts, a moment when fear stopped being the main force and became merely one element among many. Madison looked at the folder of documents Caleb wanted signed and saw it for what it was. Not paperwork, but a collar. Not a shared project, but a mechanism to bind her permanently to a system that would swallow her. She packed quietly, choosing items that could hide the evidence. She wrapped the storage card in fabric and pressed it deep into a cosmetic case. She folded the photocopies into separate compartments, distributing risk. She kept her movements slow to avoid noise, her breathing controlled to avoid panic. She did not cry. Tears would have been a luxury, an emotional release that might dull her clarity. She moved to the window and looked out at the island's dark edge where jungle met ocean. The beauty no longer seduced her. It revealed itself as camouflage for violence. In the distance, a security light swept across trees, slow and patient. Madison watched it and realized that Caleb's control was not frantic. It was confident. He believed she would choose safety. He believed she would choose him. She placed her hand over her mouth and inhaled through her nose until her pulse steadied. She made herself imagine Caleb's face if she left, not the gentle one he displayed, but the one in the dock footage, the one that did not ask permission. She let that image harden her resolve. Somewhere on the island, Ethan had risked leaving her truth, knowing it might become his last act. The evidence was not only a weapon against Caleb. It was a hand reaching through darkness, offering Madison a way out that required her to become someone Caleb could not own. She did not know if Ethan was alive. She did not know if escape was possible. She did not know what the outside world would believe if she emerged with allegations against a man like Caleb. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. If she stayed, there would be no witnesses, and eventually there would be no choice. Madison understood that escape did not begin with running. It began with transmission. The island still slept under the illusion of control when she initiated the process. Dawn had not yet arrived, and the sky remained a heavy slate color, the kind that absorbed sound and blurred edges. She moved through the house with the calm of someone who had already accepted loss. Fear no longer rushed ahead of her thoughts. It followed at a measured distance, present but contained, like a shadow that no longer dictated direction. She did not attempt to outmaneuver the security systems directly. Caleb's network was designed to detect obvious interference. Instead, she relied on redundancy, the weakness hidden inside systems built by people who believed themselves untouchable. The island's communications infrastructure had been layered for convenience as much as secrecy. Private lines fed into commercial satellites. Backup channels existed to reassure investors. Somewhere inside that complexity, a narrow corridor remained open, meant for emergencies, audits, or quiet legal contingencies that assumed loyalty from those who used them. Madison accessed it from a terminal she had never been discouraged from using, because Caleb had never considered her a threat. She uploaded the material in segments, fragmenting the evidence so that no single interruption could stop it. Files went to journalists known for surviving lawsuits. Copies went to environmental watchdog groups that had been waiting for proof. Legal documentation was routed to international regulators outside Caleb's preferred jurisdiction. The storage card's contents were duplicated and encrypted, then released in staggered intervals, timed to prevent suppression. Each transfer felt like a small detonation, invisible but irreversible. As the final upload completed, Madison closed the terminal and sat back, her hands resting on her knees. She did not feel triumph. What she felt instead was an unfamiliar emptiness, the hollow space left when a long-held tension finally released. The act of exposure did not make her powerful. It made her lighter, and that lightness came with grief. She knew exactly what she had destroyed. Caleb's public image would fracture first, not shatter all at once. Questions would surface, then investigations. His allies would distance themselves with practiced concern. Charitable boards would suspend affiliations pending review. The language would be polite, procedural, devastating. His power had always relied on perception as much as capital. Once perception cracked, the rest would follow. But Madison's own life would collapse alongside it. Her marriage would not end quietly. There would be lawyers, statements, strategic leaks. She would be painted as unstable, manipulated, emotionally compromised by trauma. Caleb's people would not accuse her directly. They would suggest, imply, and allow the narrative to form organically around her supposed fragility. Sympathy could be just as isolating as blame. She accepted this without bitterness. The cost of truth was never paid by one person alone. The island reacted before Caleb did. Security tightened within minutes of the first external alerts. Lights flared across the property. Radios crackled with controlled urgency. Movement increased, purposeful and coordinated. Madison remained in her room, not hiding, not fleeing, simply waiting. She understood that sudden absence would confirm guilt. Presence, calm presence, was its own kind of defiance. Caleb arrived shortly after sunrise. His composure was intact, but altered. The change was subtle, visible only to someone who knew him intimately. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if he were conserving something valuable. His eyes assessed rather than searched. He already knew what had happened. Madison met his gaze without apology. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He behaved as though the situation were a miscalculation that could still be corrected with the right adjustment. He framed the unfolding consequences as misunderstandings, misinterpretations, errors magnified by hostile actors. He positioned himself as the calm center of a temporary storm. Madison listened, and for the first time in years, she felt no pull toward reconciliation. She saw the shape of his love clearly now. It was not affection, not partnership, not even obsession in the romantic sense. It was authorship. Caleb loved the way a writer loves a character he believes he created. He could not tolerate deviation from the role he had assigned her. When he realized she would not recant, that she would not participate in damage control, his expression shifted again. Something closed behind his eyes. The warmth did not vanish, it hardened. He began to speak of protection in narrower terms, of safety as containment rather than care. Madison recognized the moment when persuasion ended and calculation began. She did not wait to see what form it would take. Leaving the house required no dramatic confrontation. The island's systems were in flux, attention divided between external crisis and internal coordination. Madison moved through a side exit she had memorized the night before. She carried only what she could justify later as personal belongings. The evidence no longer needed her. It had entered the world and would move on its own momentum. The shoreline greeted her with wind and salt. The sea was restless but navigable, its surface broken by long, slow swells rather than chaos. A small maintenance vessel sat tethered where it was not supposed to be, its presence a final, silent gift. She did not know whether Ethan had left it intentionally or whether it had been forgotten during evacuation. She only knew that it was there, and that it was enough. She untied the lines with hands that did not tremble. As the island receded behind her, Madison felt the weight of it shift from threat to memory. She did not look back until the distance softened the details into silhouette. The island remained beautiful, even now. That beauty no longer deceived her. By the time authorities intercepted the vessel, the narrative had already escaped Caleb's control. News outlets were circulating leaked documents. Environmental agencies were issuing statements. Legal teams were mobilizing. The island was no longer a private kingdom. It was evidence. Madison answered questions with precision and restraint. She provided timelines. She confirmed authenticity. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She allowed facts to speak with their own brutality. The professionals around her recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice of someone who had crossed a threshold and could not be coaxed back. Ethan did not appear. There were no sightings, no confirmations, no messages. Searches turned up nothing conclusive. His absence was complete, not abrupt but absolute, like a door closed so carefully it left no mark. Madison understood what that meant. Ethan had never wanted recognition. He had wanted balance restored, damage acknowledged, truth released into the open where it could no longer be buried. He had given her the last piece, and then stepped out of the story. Madison mourned him in private, not as a lover, not as a promise, but as a presence that had altered her trajectory irrevocably. What had passed between them had not needed language or future. It had been forged under pressure, stripped of illusion, and therefore unsustainable in any world that pretended to be normal. Some connections existed only to break others. The legal process unfolded slowly, as such processes always did. Caleb fought with everything he had, but his responses grew less effective as each layer of his protection failed. Investors withdrew. Boards distanced themselves. Former partners became witnesses. The system he had built to insulate himself began to turn inward, consuming its own architecture. Madison watched from a distance, her name appearing in headlines she did not read twice. She relocated without announcement, choosing anonymity over vindication. She allowed herself to be lost in crowds, to exist without explanation. Freedom did not arrive as relief. It arrived as silence. There were nights when she woke with the sensation of being observed, her body still calibrated to surveillance. There were mornings when she missed the certainty of structure, even though that structure had been a prison. There were moments when guilt surfaced unexpectedly, not for exposing Caleb, but for surviving him. She carried the memory of Ethan like a scar that did not ache unless touched. She carried the knowledge of what she had been complicit in without intending to be. She carried the understanding that her freedom had been purchased with consequences she would never fully witness. Yet beneath all of it, something else grew. A steadiness. Madison learned to make choices without anticipating correction. She learned to occupy space without apology. She learned that safety did not mean absence of danger, but presence of agency. The darkness she had walked through did not vanish. It integrated, becoming part of her perception rather than an external threat. She did not romanticize what had happened. She did not frame it as triumph. She understood that the story did not end with justice or love or redemption. It ended with clarity. Sometimes darkness did not corrupt. Sometimes it illuminated what light had hidden too well. Sometimes stepping into shadow was the only way to see the shape of the cage and find the opening. Madison stood alone on a public beach months later, the ocean wide and indifferent before her. No guards watched her. No schedules dictated her movement. No narrative waited for her compliance. She felt the weight of everything she had lost, and she did not deny it. She felt the cost of what she had chosen, and she accepted it. She had not escaped unmarked. But she had escaped. And in that dark, quiet freedom, she finally belonged to herself. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.